11,000 years ago, before a single brick had ever been fired, before anyone had planted a field of wheat or tamed a single animal, a group of hunter-gatherers dragged multi-ton stone pillars up a hillside in southeastern Turkey and carved them with foxes, scorpions, and vultures. Then, centuries later, their descendants did something almost no one expected. They buried the whole thing on purpose. Not destroyed, not abandoned, buried carefully, like a secret being tucked away. And archaeologists are still trying to figure out why. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it broke the textbook the moment it was uncovered. For most of the 20th century, the story of civilization had a clean shape. First came farming, then came surplus food, then came villages, then cities, then temples, then kings. Religion and monuments were supposed to be the reward for agriculture, something people built only after they had settled down and secured their next meal. It was a tidy staircase, and nobody thought to question it, because nothing ever showed up out of order. Then, in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started digging into a low, unremarkable hill near the city of Sanliurfa, a place local farmers had walked over for generations, occasionally turning up strange carved stones they assumed were just debris from an old Byzantine cemetery. Schmidt suspected there was something older underneath. What his team found rewrote the timeline of human history. Beneath that hill were rings of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, arranged in circular and oval enclosures. At the center of the largest rings stood 2 towering pillars facing one another, and carved into their surfaces were foxes caught mid-leap, snakes coiling down the stone, wild boars, cranes, and vultures with wings spread. Some of the pillars even have stylized arms carved along their sides, bending at what would be an elbow, with hands meeting near the front, as though the pillars themselves are meant to represent standing figures rather than simple stone posts. Radiocarbon dating of material from the site placed the oldest construction phases at roughly 9,600 BCE, which makes Göbekli Tepe older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and older than the pyramids of Giza by roughly 7,000 years. It predates pottery, it predates writing, it predates the wheel, and it was built, by every line of evidence we have, by people who had not yet domesticated crops or animals in the way later Neolithic societies would. That last point is the one that genuinely upended archaeology, and it's worth sitting with, because it's not exaggeration, it's the real controversy. The old model assumed that monumental construction required agriculture first, because you need a stable food surplus to free up labor for building projects that don't produce food themselves. Göbekli Tepe suggested the opposite might be true, at least in part. Communities of hunter-gatherers, who by definition were still highly mobile and dependent on wild resources, organized themselves well enough to quarry, transport, shape, and erect stones weighing many tons. Some hauled from limestone bedrock a few hundred meters away. That takes coordination. It takes planning across many people, probably across many different groups who didn't live together year-round. Some researchers now argue that the gathering itself, the seasonal coming together of scattered bands to build and worship at a shared site, might have been one of the very pressures that pushed people towards settling down and eventually farming, rather than farming being the thing that made gathering possible. In other words, the ritual and social need may have come first, and agriculture followed as a way to feed the crowds. That's not proven fact, it's one of several competing theories, but it's a real and actively debated idea in archaeology, and it flips the old assumption on its head in a way that doesn't require any invented science to be startling. Then there's the burial. This part is completely real and remains one of the strangest aspects of the entire site. At some point, long after these enclosures were built and used, the people who built them, or their descendants, filled the rings in deliberately, not with wind-blown sand over centuries of neglect, but with a mixture of rubble, animal bone, flint debris, and soil, packed in around the standing pillars until the entire structure disappeared beneath what looked, from the surface, like just another hill. This wasn't a single quick event either. Excavation suggests it happened over generations, enclosure by enclosure, as older rings were filled in and new ones were built nearby. Why would anyone go through the enormous effort of raising these pillars, only to intentionally cover them? Archaeologists have proposed a few explanations. One is that this was a form of ritual closure, a way of decommissioning a sacred space once its purpose had been fulfilled, not unlike how some cultures ritually retire objects or structures rather than simply discarding them. Another is more practical, as older enclosures fell out of use, filling them and created a stable platform for new construction directly on top, layer after layer, the way a tell mound forms in the Near East over centuries of rebuilding. Neither explanation involves buried alien knowledge or a lost precursor civilization. The honest answer, the one you'll hear from the archaeologists who actually excavated the site, is that we don't fully know, and that not knowing is part of what makes it fascinating rather than needing to be dressed up with invented detail. The carvings themselves are another genuine source of ongoing debate. The animals depicted, foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boar, aurochs, and various birds, don't appear to be random decoration. Many researchers think they carried symbolic or mythological meaning for the people who carved them, possibly linked to totems, hunting practices, seasonal changes, or clan identities of different groups who used different enclosures. One especially discussed pillar, sometimes nicknamed the vulture stone, is carved with a vulture, a scorpion, and what some researchers have functioned as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, dedicated to Osiris, and by extension to Seti himself in his identity as Osiris in the afterlife. Osiris was the god who died and was resurrected to rule the underworld, and Egyptian creation mythology described the first land emerging from a primordial ocean of chaotic water. The Osirians' design mirrors that myth directly. At its center is a raised stone platform, sometimes called the Osiris bed, standing like an island, and the surrounding chamber was designed to hold water, evoking the primordial waters from which creation itself began. Building this chamber in a stripped-down, weighty, archaic style, deliberately reminiscent of Egypt's most ancient monuments, would have reinforced the sense that this was a place outside of ordinary time, a structure meant to feel as old and as eternal as the myth it was recreating. In other words, the strangeness was the point. This kind of architectural archaism was not unheard of in Egyptian religious building. Ancient civilizations frequently reached backward, deliberately invoking older styles for their most sacred structures, because age itself carried spiritual authority. A king who wanted to bind his memory to the eternal did not necessarily want his tomb to look fashionable and modern. He wanted it to look timeless. Seti I, ruling during a period when Egypt was consciously restoring and referencing its own deep past after the upheavals of the Amarna period under Akhenaten, had particular reason to reach backward stylistically and reconnect his reign with Egypt's oldest traditions. None of this makes the Osirian less remarkable as an engineering achievement. The granite used in its construction did not come from anywhere near Abydos. It was quarried at Aswan, a considerable distance to the south, and transported down the Nile before being cut, fitted, and set in place without mortar, with joints precise enough that the structure has held for over 3,000 years. Some of the largest architrave beams are estimated by researchers to weigh in the range of many tens of tons, placing this among the more demanding stoneworking projects of the New Kingdom. Even if it wasn't the singular anomaly some popular accounts describe it as. Ancient Egyptian engineers had, by this period, centuries of experience moving enormous stones, dating back to the Pyramid Age and the construction of monuments like the Valley Temple at Giza that Neville himself compared it to. The skill needed to build the Osirian did not appear from nowhere and vanish afterward. It was a continuation of a very old Egyptian tradition of massive stone construction, applied here to a religious concept that called for exactly that kind of weight and permanence. The chamber's relationship with water adds another layer that is worth separating fact from exaggeration on. Today, visitors and photographs often show the lower sections of the Osirian partially flooded, with water pooling around the central platform. Some of this flooding is symbolic and original to the design, tied to the primordial ocean concept described earlier. But the modern water level has also been affected by changes to the regional water table since the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century, which altered groundwater behavior across the whole region. This means the amount of standing water visitors see today is not necessarily identical to what existed when the structure was completed, which is a genuinely useful piece of context rather than evidence of any hidden older civilization. What makes the Osirian worth talking about, then, isn't a secret that Egyptology tried to bury. It's the opposite. It's a case study in how archaeology actually works, in the way scientific understanding is supposed to update. Neville and Murray looked at genuinely unusual stonework, compared it honestly to what they knew, and proposed a reasonable but incomplete hypothesis. Later excavation by Frankfurt produced better physical evidence, a cartouche embedded in the very joints of the construction, and the picture became clearer. That is not a cover-up. That is exactly how good historical science should function: incomplete evidence followed by better evidence, followed by a more accurate conclusion. The Osirian remains one of the strangest and most beautiful structures from the ancient world, not because its origins are unexplained, but because of what its design tells us about how deeply the Egyptians understood the emotional power of age, myth, and permanence, and how deliberately they were willing to build all three into solid stone. Even now, walking down that long descending passage at Abydos, past Seti's magnificent painted temple, and into the stark granite hall behind it, you can feel the intentional shift the ancient architects built into the experience, moving from a temple that celebrates a living king into a chamber built to feel like the edge of eternity itself. It is a reminder that not every mystery in ancient history needs a hidden civilization to explain it. Sometimes the true story of an ambitious pharaoh deliberately reaching thousands of years into his own past to build something that would feel timeless is the more remarkable one. So tell me, what's the ancient structure you'd want me to take apart next? The one everyone assumes has a simple explanation, but that might actually be hiding something far more interesting in plain sight? Interpreted as a headless human figure, along with a series of markings that a 2024 academic study proposed might represent a kind of early solar or lunisolar calendar, possibly even referencing a comet event. That paper generated real headlines and real scientific pushback in equal measure. Plenty of specialists in Near Eastern archaeology and astronomy remain skeptical, arguing that reading a precise calendar system into carvings this old, from a culture that left us no writing to confirm the interpretation, is speculative at best. That tension, one team proposing a bold reading of the symbols and other experts urging caution, is the actual, honest state of the research right now. It's a genuine live debate rather than a settled mystery, and honestly, that's more interesting than a manufactured answer, because it means the story is still being written by real scientists in real time. What's also true, and doesn't need any embellishment, is just how much labor and organization the site represents. Some of the pillars are estimated to weigh between 8 and 20 tons. Quarry marks found on partially worked pillars still lying in the bedrock nearby show the process was left mid-task in places, giving archaeologists a rare, direct look at ancient stoneworking technique. Pounding with harder stone tools, working along natural fracture lines, gradually freeing a pillar from the rock shelf it grew out of. Moving those blocks even a few hundred meters, without wheels, without draft animals domesticated for hauling, using rope, wooden sledges, and raw human effort, would have required dozens of people working together with real logistical planning. That alone tells us these communities were far more organized and far more capable of long-term cooperative projects than the old simple hunter-gatherer stereotype gave them credit for. You don't need to invent impossible precision to be impressed by that. The real achievement is already remarkable. Excavation at Göbekli Tepe is still ongoing today, now led by Turkish and German teams, including researchers from the German Archaeological Institute, and only a fraction of the roughly 22-acre site has been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys, which really are used at the site, suggest there are more buried enclosures still waiting beneath the soil, along with related sites nearby, like Karahan Tepe, discovered more recently and showing its own distinct pillars, some carved with unsettling human-like faces staring out from niches carved into bedrock. Karahan Tepe is part of what researchers now call the Taz or Stone Hills, a cluster of related Neolithic sites across the region that together are reshaping how we understand this period. This wasn't an isolated monument built by one mysterious group and then lost to time. It looks increasingly like it was part of a wider cultural network of early ceremonial centers, built by related communities across southeastern Anatolia, each with their own variations on similar themes. So, what's the honest takeaway? The one that doesn't need any invented mystery to land? It's this. Long before farming, before pottery, before permanent villages, as we usually picture them, groups of hunter-gatherers were capable of large-scale cooperative construction, symbolic art, and what looks like organized ritual life. That single fact quietly demolished 100 years of assumptions about the order in which civilization is supposed to develop. And the deliberate, careful burial of these enclosures remains a real and unresolved question, one that current archaeologists are still actively investigating rather than one anyone has definitively solved. The mystery here isn't laser scanners revealing impossible tolerances or messages hidden where no hand could reach. The mystery is much simpler and honestly much more human. Why did a community go to extraordinary lengths to build something magnificent and then choose, with just as much effort, to put it back into the earth? Was it reverence? Was it fear? Was it simply how they understood the natural life cycle of a sacred place, built, used, and eventually laid to rest like the people who worship there? We don't have the answer yet, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. What we do have is a hillside in Turkey that keeps forcing historians to rewrite the opening chapter of the human story, one careful excavation season at a time. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If a wandering, pre-agricultural people could organize themselves well enough to raise monuments like this, purely out of belief, ritual, or shared identity, what does that tell us about how civilization actually begins? Maybe it isn't food surpluses and cities that come first at all. Maybe it's simply people finding a reason to gather and deciding something is worth building together. Tell me what you think that reason was. Was it grief? Was it worship? Was it fear of something they no longer wanted to remember? Drop your theory in the comments. And if this pulled back the curtain on how much of ancient history is still being actively rewritten, subscribe, because there's a lot more buried under these hills than we've uncovered yet.